And I think one thing you mentioned in your profile that, how this EU, the European Union, this original idea about, some kind of, it's not coordination, like something, they are supposed to do, and then ended up with like something much bigger. But the initial plan was not that. They ended up with like, this more integration, more political unity, and like more like the high politics, no? So they're trying to move towards that, and then it creates lots of problem. So if you just walk us through, like, this, like, what was the actually, the original plan with this integration?
I don't really know what it is that interests me specifically, but what I'm interested in is kind of like, I suppose, classic and integration theory of the EU. It's the real classics about why is it the EU's changed from this form to this form. But I'm interested in times of crisis as well, because I'm not as optimistic as some of the people who study it in terms of it will go towards maybe a federation or something. I don't think it will, and actually I quite like how it's structured. It's a compromise between people who think that the nation state is the most important, and people who think that the European Union is a sort of one political unit. There's a compromise there between the different institutions, and that's why I think it works. People might think it doesn't work, but actually I think in terms of some sort of compromise that we can be happy with, that's quite a nice kind of ground and kind of how that's developed. So I'm interested in it as far as, how does this equilibrium change, and kind of why is it changing towards certain things? And so because what I'm interested in looking at next is kind of, they come up with a lot of these projects and they kind of fizzle out, because I noticed along the way there's a lot of projects they start to fizzle out. So why do some projects fizzle out and others don't? That's kind of what I'm, because I don't agree with this whole disintegration. So that's kind of like an overview of, like, there's more to it than this. But what my thesis was about, and what my research was primarily about, is the 1970s. There were a lot of changes in terms of the global politics, and there'd always been kind of talk about how they would deal with certain problems in foreign affairs. But really, like, there was a view that within some of the scholarly community that was that the EU would stay primarily with market stuff that was established to do. So free movement of goods, people, capital, and the other one that I will be mocked thoroughly for forgetting, but it's beside the point. Primarily market integration. So in the 1970s, they founded this body called European Political Cooperation, which was a foreign policy body to coordinate it. Now, what's interesting about it is that the constitution it's written on was like 2 pages. And it was like that because he couldn't agree anything about what it would do. There were lots of kind of elements in this string, so it's quite kind of nebulous what it was actually supposed to do. But they found a role for it, and it gradually evolved to what we now know as like the European Come First security policy. It's hugely got loads of these. Got an external action service. It's got a commissioner / vice president. Was the high representative / vice president of the commission, like a really senior role attached to it. But in the 1970s, it was kind of thought, no, we don't want to go that far, because there was a view that this was part of like the state's core responsibility. But there was a disagreement at the time, though. There were certain states that still had quite an important international profile that didn't want to go forward. There were some states that were actually quite open-minded towards like a lot of cooperation. So in the end, there was a sort of like minimal kind of degree of cooperation that they could agree amongst themselves. But what's interesting about it is that narrative of large states that have a really important foreign policy footprint, not wanting to give too much power to the EU and it would affect their national interest, gradually give ground over this over the next kind of 50 years. So one thing they didn't want was a secretariat, right? They didn't want people in Brussels to be responsible for this. And it eventually got to the point where they just had to, because but one of the biggest disagreements was, where should it be based? Because if it's based in Brussels, then it's a European institution. Where if it's based in Paris, then it's a international organization. So we can still keep it separate from the EU. Then in 1992, it became an EU pillar, so it was part of the EU, but not part of that. And then with Lisbon, it was still, they got rid of the pillar system, but it still had its own kind of special bit. So it's just this gradual erosion of what was originally set up to kind of say, this is a member state responsibility. We don't want to have this as an EU policy, but gradually it's eroded and comes into it. And really, to me, there's kind of two reasons. There's one insofar as like, it's just more efficient. A lot of these changes, like having a secretariat. In 1970, you didn't need a secretariat because they weren't doing anything. But by 1981, they were making quite a lot of decisions, and it was quite a lot of paperwork. So it was just not efficient to keep it. So the more work they're doing, the more they have to institutionalize to try and manage that just growing workload. But what I'm wanting to look at now is it's not clear that there will be a growing workload. It's not the case that if we decide to cooperate on something, it will naturally expand. It might not. It might be that nothing happens for 6 years, and then eventually we have to do something, which happens during the time. So to one extent, it's kind of functional, efficient. To the other extent, it's kind of political as well. But it's one thing for everyone to have a veto, but sometimes the people you don't want to veto things have a veto. So it's nice for me to have a veto, but some other countries might have it. So there was one famous case in internal security where Greece vetoed the extradition of one group of people from one state to another, or got in the way because there was disagreement over kind of the Middle East and Israel's role there. So actually, this kind of raised questions about like, well, actually, is this veto a good idea? Should we maybe find ways around it? But what's important about what I do is this has all been done for a very long time, studying this gradual development of these areas. But what the point I'm trying to make is that this is a general thing, that it applies to defense, internal security, the euro, and foreign policy, and probably other areas as well. And that we've got this classic story of how integration works, but in these other areas where it starts out outside the treaties, it's because of the type of area that is. So I'm really, what it is I'm doing is kind of conceptual insofar as saying these are all the same. Like everyone's describing this similar process. It's just they've all got their own little elements they like to highlight. But it's so I'm just generalizing existing concepts. Really, is what that project's about. Trying to make a point that like a lot of what we're saying in the Eurozone today isn't brand new. The Eurozone, the Eurogroup is an example of a body that literally used to meet for 2 hours before the Council on the Economy, and they were only allowed to meet for 2 hours. And then now it's got its own press conferences. It meets overnight. You would have seen it with the Greece crisis, sovereign debt crisis. That they had these huge meetings that had their own like working groups. They have all these things that they never intended to have. But this is quite a common thing that happens in these areas. But it's not by any means certain that it goes in that direction. That's kind of what I'm interested now in, is that there are some cases that they found these sorts of things and they just kind of fizzle out because generally not like the larger bodies, but more specific bodies, like an arms development or something. They say we want to do something in arms development, but it kind of just fizzles out. It doesn't really work. So that's the direction I'm kind of interested in going into as well, because what really seems to me to be the issue is not disintegration insofar as like states will leave. Brexit's not really a common case. And when you read a lot of stuff on disintegration, they're struggling for case studies sometimes because I and someone who studies this might disagree with me, but the feeling I get is that it's hard to generalize because there's not a huge amount of cases of clear disintegration. And I think disintegration is just a nice, sexy term to use for it.
Yeah.
Really, what I think is the bigger worry is what we saw in the 1970s, which I call it stagnation, but like it turns out some people don't think the EU stagnated in the 70s, which I disagree with. Which is what I'm working on just now, is trying to say actually it did, but you just got the wrong dependent variable. Which is that it's not really about integration and disintegration, it's about actual workload day to day. So you can still be doing more things, but you just can't, you might not be agreeing things. It might take more work to agree things. And I think that's probably the bigger threat to the EU, because as we talked about earlier, people care about these issues being dealt with day to day. And if you can't agree solutions to it, it doesn't look very good.
I mean, if you talk about this Europe's disintegration process, the long trajectory, do you think like in the 90s, do you think that's quite, those changes, the big ones came in the like early 90s and the mid 90s, and then this extension of large Euro, or it's quite a very short period of time we saw like lots of things happened. Do you think, I mean, what's your take on that? Those changes, do you think, I mean, can you explain like why those things are happening?
What was interesting about it is that there's two kind of different ways you can look at it. So the Maastricht Treaty can be looked at in terms of a big expansion of competences for like in foreign policy. Internal security is kind of interesting because it became a pillar, but they didn't add a huge amount to it. It kind of took, they dealt with a few things. They introduced, they did a lot of work in introducing Europol. It wasn't until the treaty at the end of the 90s that they kind of decided something. It's the Amsterdam Treaty, and then it had a period over something like 6 years where it had to sort of work like this, and then at the end of the 6-year period we'll decide where it comes in. So a lot of the changes that happened at these points were kind of just writing down what had already been agreed and what had already come about. So the common foreign security policy, they're like a lot of the things that are in that treaty in terms of how they make decisions or what the job is, isn't particularly above and beyond what was already being done in the 80s through European political cooperation. The big step was kind of recognizing that actually there's a lot of overlap between foreign policy and other areas of policy, and having this like clear. There's a famous story of a meeting in 1973 in Copenhagen, and it's used all the time by people who study EPC. I put it at the start of my thesis, which is that they were so keen to keep these separate that they met in Copenhagen as EPC, and then all the foreign ministers got on a plane, flew to Brussels, and then they met as the foreign ministers of the at the time of EEC, right? So as the General Affairs Committee. So they wanted them physically separate, and I think that's a good way of showing that over the long run, if you have a lot of overlap between trade and foreign policy and all these things, eventually it's just kind of keeping it that separate isn't really that effective. So Maastricht was a big step forward, but it also, like in defense, it wasn't until the 2000s that it was kind of incorporated. At the time, the Western European Union was still a thing, and this was one of these bodies outside. The only reason they picked that one was because some of the countries in the European Union were neutral and they were involved in EPC. So Ireland's an example of this. So they originally in 1979 were thinking, okay, we'll do a defence arm fit because there's overlaps in what we're doing here in defence. But of course, certain neutral countries didn't want that, so they decided to resurrect this body that kind of just fizzled out and said, well, this will be the space we do it. One of the issues with the Western European Union is it had a lot of countries in it, like Turkey, that were members of what would become the European Union. So eventually that fizzled out and was replaced by what essentially was like a fourth pillar, but became the common security and defence policy, which is still developing to this day. And so basically what I'm saying is that a lot of the changes that happened at these treaty events are kind of the culmination of what came before. And it's very easy to start off by agreeing, here's what we're already doing. One of the very interesting changes is PESCO. I wrote something on that, and it was basically what I was pointing out was that what PESCO was supposed to be was like a common battle group to go out and fight missions overseas. But, and there were a lot of countries that had a lot of very controversial meetings. I think it's called the Chocolate Summit or something stupid like that, where they had a meeting. They were like, we want to have a European shared battle group or something like that. They can go out and intervene. And by the time it got to the treaty, it was watered down dramatically to try and get something in. Then what ended up, it sat there in the treaty for like, so 2009 roughly to 2016, so like 7 years, very much done with it. But it was when Trump got elected that they decided to resurrect it. And all they ended up doing with PESCO was developing common arms. If you look at what they do, they're like developing a Eurodrone. There's some, that's one of the sexier things it does. There's a lot of stuff in like coordinating coastline missions. And some of these are only between two states. So like Cyprus and Greece have a PESCO policy between each other. It's not even the case like it's a whole EU. It's just like two countries are just using PESCO as the sort of framework to do this. But there's been a huge amount of development in that area, but it was nothing like what was originally anticipated. So sometimes they come up with these things, put them in the treaty, and then Nigel Farage goes and says, PESCO is going to be a common European army. And then you're like, well, that's not you can't invade someone with like research and development prowess. It's the easy stuff to there is no European army. PESCO is not that. But, so again, that's another example of something at the treaty happens, but what actually came into effect was pretty different. So a lot of these big changes happen between treaties, and the treaties kind of just bring them together. It's not to say that nothing happens in treaties in terms of expanding power, but a lot of the really fundamental things happen. Just kind of, you know, this isn't working efficiently, what can we do? And if everyone agrees on it, you know, you're allowed to amend the treaties if there's unanimity. You don't have to write a new treaty if you want to fix these things. In particular, one of the things that they said was an advantage of these informal groups outside the treaty was for flexibility. And really what they were saying was, the court's not got any say over this. So if we decide to start having a secretariat, we can do that. We can just say, wow, we've got a secretariat now, even though it's against the rules, because there's no court to say you can't do that. That's what really they meant by flexibility. It's not that flexible because because it's unanimity, if one state says, I don't want that, then it doesn't happen. But it's just there's fewer legal barriers to changing these, which now there's more legal barriers to doing that.
I mean, I think, like, if I say, like, you know, the way European Union was trying to do things, it's like more kind of the template is the state, how state behaves, you know, they try to separate things and then make it more efficient. But also it brings lots of bureaucracy as well, lots of, you know, civil servants on the ground. Because the problem is then, you know, because individual states are doing those things already. Now they have to do it like again in another body. So for the UN, United Nations, it's easy. It's not like too clunky. But with the European Union, they brought lots of things now. So piled up lots of things, and then, you know, try to solve things in a united front, which, you know, thus law politics is easy, you know, like normal stuff, trade and other things. But the problem is when it becomes the defense, foreign policy and all those things, then it creates problem.
But those problems are more often, in my view, to do with the state's preferences and the kind of trying to reach a consensus and something that states can accept than it is to do with, you know, the bureaucracy. You know, so they've introduced a lot of rules. One of the compromises over reform of home affairs was the emergency brake, and they never ended up using that, as far as I'm aware, unless they've used it the last couple of years and I didn't notice. But I don't think they probably did, because it was Britain who did that, who was kind of a big advocate for that. But also, like, there's things called like constructive abstention, where you can abstain but not block it. Even in areas where you have qualified majority voting, I mean, what's important about that is you could have a vote, so you could be outvoted, so you have to compromise. You still reach consensus, because consensus is the informal norm of how decisions are made in the EU. So there's, you know, just looking at how it's written formally isn't enough. We've got to look at the informal rules which they're following as well. It's not enough to just say, okay, we introduced this new procedure, because they might not want to use that procedure because of a norm of reaching consensus. So it might not be that it's the bureaucracy, it's the culture of how they reach decisions. But one of the interesting things is the kind of, in the 70s, when this was all coming about, one of the commissioners, Ralph Dahrendorf, wrote this piece that I cite all the time. And I like it because he writes in very plain terms. He says, you know, in the 70s, they were really fed up of the bureaucracy of the EU, that they were arguing about frozen sides of meat, and nobody cared about frozen sides of meat. And he says they were talking in Euro-Chinese, he calls it. So, like, you know, I probably wouldn't call it that term these days, but essentially he's saying there's a lot of jargon that they were talking. You couldn't really understand it. Everything was prepared. So they started up these new informal bodies, and it was great, because now we can actually talk about things in plain terms and talk about what interests us. And then the foreign ministers can meet up and they can talk about foreign policy, and the internal security ministers can meet up and they can talk about what they want to talk about. And this is so much more efficient. It's great. We don't have all these barriers and formalities. But these ended up coming about anyway, because as you would expect, once you start making a lot of decisions in a lot of different policy areas, you've got to have the bureaucracy to do it. It's not necessarily more efficient to have no structures there. So there's some interesting work that might kind of, well, not might, in some ways runs counter to what some of the stuff I claim, which emphasizes kind of the importance of dinners and informal summits. If he put it as now, I engaged a lot with what he wrote, because he was writing that on the Eurogroup, that a lot of decisions are made in informal settings, and it's actually a really important policy input itself. It's just having an informal discussion, being able to see eye to eye outside of these formal summits and formal bureaucracies. But this is factored in as a part of like how they do business. But ultimately, you know, a lot of these bodies developed a lot of these new procedures and bureaucracies because they had to just deal with a lot of different decisions in a lot of different areas. It's one thing, in the 70s to be meeting 4 times a year about whatever the issue is, but eventually when new crises come along and you're like, okay, we want to deal with that, you have to introduce procedures. Also, like if you're Greece and you enter the European Union, after they've been doing business this way for a long time, there's nothing written down. How are you going to catch up to what it is that they're doing? There's no written book. They used a rule book. So they did technically have something that's a rule book, but they handed it to them. One of the issues was, for example, the rotating presidency was a way of stopping the European Commission having too much power. But of course, rotating presidencies create a lot of uncertainty and a lot of problems because you've not had the presidency in 5 years, and then you get handed, here's all the decisions we've made. And oh yeah, we changed these procedures. It becomes a nightmare to manage. So bureaucracy doesn't always result in negative. Sometimes, like the whole point of institutions is to make it more efficient. And it's more calculable what it is you can do, what's expected of you. So I suppose the point is that there's a mix now. There's informal spaces to have these sorts of meetings and discussions, and they're important to the policy process, but there's also an importance of formality in bureaucracy because it can be more efficient than the alternative, which is just chaos.
Like, because I mean, these are, long-winded talk. I mean, so we cannot carry on the forever.
Yeah.
So like, I mean, I will just pick like a couple of like important time era. So like, I mean, when you talk about this, especially like when Brexit is a big thing, so many people say that, oh, Brexit has got nothing to do with actually Europe. It's more to do with like Tory party try to fix their own party things. What's your take on that kind of arguments?
I try to stay away from the stuff from Brexit because I'm emotionally involved in it.
Yeah.
So I've read more about
part of the research is you have this historical background, how it's built up. What you are saying that it's already there. Things were in the like 70s already, but they decided in like 2016.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors you can look at. And one of the factors that's looked at is the kind of long-term kind of cultural aspect in terms of how does Britain differ from other EU member states. So historically, Britain has this role and sees itself, it didn't have to join the project early on. And I can see that to some extent, the problem is falsifiability, right? In that it's very easy to pick these, like you're starting from the question, how is Britain different from other European states to explain Brexit? There's no other states you can compare it to. So it's very hard to draw those conclusions as generalizable. So like you're saying that, well, what other European country didn't suffer that much in the World War II? Well, you could say that, I don't know, there were countries that stayed neutral or whatever, or, how does Sweden fit into that narrative? So to me, these issues it's very hard to explain in those terms. One of the things that I find interesting about it, which doesn't really answer your question, but it's kind of one of the more relevant to what I do, is that the point I like to make about these is they're a compromise between countries that want one system and another, right? So it's not the case that common foreign security policy is a federalized kind of EU policy or even just like a standard like community procedure. It's not. There's still loads of features in there that are not used in other areas of policy. The reason is I would say, it's an equilibrium between different interests, right? They've reached a state which they can all kind of agree on. And if they're doing more work and they require more integration to try and manage with that more work, or if, say, one of the more powerful states isn't getting what they want through other means, and they have to use the EU instead, Ukraine is in a situation where this is the case, then we might have more integration, but it's a compromise. And I made this point to someone who's a Eurosceptic. I said, one of the arguments against Europe all the time is it's not democratic enough. We don't vote for the Commission. But who are the ones that are saying we shouldn't vote for the Commission? It's always the ones that say the government should be in charge and the governments make the decision, because they want the governments to appoint the Commission president, because it's the governments who are the authorities in Europe. And it's the Council still ultimately that has more sway over certain decisions in the Parliament on the whole. The Parliament's hugely important now, but there's still kind of, I remember talking to someone who worked for the European Parliament saying that when they were in Brussels, sometimes they were, how do you work for the Parliament? It wouldn't be the same extent of prestige. I think it's changing over time, and I know someone might be offended by that, but You know, I don't fit neatly into either category in this as well, but basically, if you knew your European integration, you would know how controversial that was, maybe a statement. Anyway, the point is that it's a compromise between different positions. So you've got people who think the EU has a common interest, and you've got the Commission and the Parliament and all these things. And the Parliament become more and more powerful over the years. This democracy thing, there's more to elect, so it's direct democracy. But there's also this perspective that it's the member states that are ultimately the ones in charge. And to me, the constitutional settlement we have in Europe is a compromise between these two. So if you say the European Union should be more democratic and elected by the people, you're kind of saying that the states should, reduce their role somewhat, and the people elect the President Commission, which would make them more powerful than would otherwise be. I don't know if you saw this about what they called the Spitzenkandidaten, which was that the Parliament gets to choose who the leader for the Commission would be. The member states in the end decided, no, we don't want that person. We want, I think it was Ursula von der Leyen that they ended up picking. And she wasn't picked by the Parliament, so this was a kind of bit of a tussle over legitimacy in the EU. But to me, what I like about the EU is it's a compromise. It's a compromise between different philosophical positions on what Europe should be. And it makes it less efficient in some ways relative to a state, but it also means that nobody's winning at anyone's expense. It's Pareto optimal, as we're talking about.
One of the criticism, whenever I talk to students, from different groups, different ideas, different kind of background, some students, one of the sticking point is, this suddenly Europe becomes, 27 countries, and then, open the border, and then all those people came to your country, and the wage just collapsed. What do you think? Do you think European Union could have done it in a better way, or do you think there's not much choice there?
I think Tony Blair could have done it in a better way, because they had, if you read, there's a book called The New Machiavelli. It's unrelated to Machiavelli readings elsewhere. It's just interesting. A guy called Jonathan Powell was talking about what he learned. He used to be very senior in number 10.
Yeah.
He was talking about how the mistake they made was that other countries phased in the kind of rules, but they thought that there wouldn't be that many people come from the 10 new member states. So they decided to just, change the rules overnight, essentially. And it turned out the prediction was wrong, and that there was a sudden change, like a very sudden shock in terms of population. And I think that was probably an error insofar as we generally don't want shocks to the system in terms of sudden changes in population. And by the way, I think, to make this point very clearly, that's not to say I don't think there should have been free movement of labour. I just think it should be phased in, because the same goes for this country just now. You don't want sudden shocks of population movement within a country either, because if everyone suddenly moves to London, then there's problems. So you want these changes to be gradual over time, whether migration is internal or between countries. And I think that was a mistake of the government rather than the EU, because other countries phased it in, but we didn't. So I think that was one of the errors, and because that allowed the issue to be politicized, it kind of.
But can I add one thing? When I talk to my economists colleagues, they are saying that in terms of migration, in terms of this huge rush of all those people came here, in terms of economy, it makes sense. You can make serious amount of money, but not everyone. Some rich people, that's the cheap labor. So in terms of economy, it made sense. So it actually helped those people to make quick bucks out of this, this social and political change, which is quite risky politically. But do you think the push came from somewhere else? Tony Blair didn't have choice, because
I don't know. I think, to be honest, sometimes as political scientists we're a bit reluctant to put things down to individual error. We're always thinking of some structural factor that caused it, rather than thinking that when you read these accounts, you say that they personally decided. You know, the poll tax, what were the structural reasons behind the poll tax? Sometimes there's a bit of agency involved in these things. I actually do think, though, to go back to my favorite political economist, Henry George, I was talking about there's three books. The first book's about an outdated theory of wages. The idea is that there's a set amount of capital out there, and wages come from capital. So if there's too many people, wages go down because there's less capital to spend on their wages, right? Nobody believes this anymore. And so when you read the book with people, because I was involved with the Henry George Society Foundation, and they did it over COVID. We're doing a reading group. But I wanted to read the book with people, so I did that because there were, you couldn't go to tutorials or anything because you graduated. So the first chapter, they were like, how is this relevant? This is an outdated economic theory. And I said, this is really relevant to immigration because the idea is ultimately the same in a lot of immigration debates, in that there's a set number of jobs out there. And if you increase the population, wages go down, right? And wages do go down if there's more labor, right? The point Henry George is making when he says this is what this is being used as is a way of blaming the employees. At the time, it was blaming the poor for having too many children, right? And they're shifting the blame onto the people who are moving for jobs and opportunity. And he says, where does this capital come from? It comes from the value added made by workers, right? It's the workers who create this value. And if you have more workers, then there's more value being created. So it will create new job opportunities. So, there's the way you could think of it in terms of there's a finite number of jobs, but there isn't. Value is created by people. If there's more people, then there's more value being created. It creates more opportunities. That's why, in the US, their economy is bigger than us. And some countries have more efficient economic systems than us. There's things that can affect productivity. But he's basically saying the big problem for him and a lot of the theories at the time, in the late 1800s, was that they were blaming the working classes basically for their own problem. The reason that they were poor was because they were having too many kids. And then he goes to Malthus, it's Malthusianism. He says he really hates Malthus. And he's like, they're just finding a way to blame poor people for being hungry. But as he said, in Ireland, when the famine was going on, Ireland was producing plenty of food to support people, but the food was going overseas. He uses India as an example as well. There was famines in India, but plenty of food being produced because of the exploitation by the British. So, he's saying like, this is all being used to shift the blame onto the people who are suffering, when really we should be looking at other factors.
That's my biggest, kind of like anger, it's like the poor people actually were fighting against the poor people rather than, like these two poor people united and said that, no, who actually did this? Who's the winner? So the whole thing, the winner is someone else, very small number of people.
In his view, it's landlords. Karl Marx disagreed on, he thought it was capitalists, but they had some interesting exchanges. It's interesting to read two political economists at the same time who are actively engaging with each other, because it's unusual to read a book review by Marx. Henry George is interesting because he kind of comes before social democracy, and a lot of kind of things that people who followed him at the time were kind of inspired into, a lot of them became Fabians, kind of, and things like that. So he's a fun guy. I just find it very interesting personally.
Because you're kind of historian as well in the Europe's, this journey up to today. So if you see through it, your historical lens, where do you see Europe in 50 years time? Can you predict something?
I'm not sure, because really I think we're entering a period that's quite interesting insofar as the EU integrated quite heavily in areas like defence after the Cold War. It was after the Cold War, and the idea back then was that wars would be interventions. So a lot of the battle groups and stuff was the idea that they could go into Yugoslavia and so on, and peacekeep there. They could form these things. And if you look at the EU missions over time, there was a big increase in the number of missions they did involving the military, but also other types of mission as well. So NAVFOR off of Somalia is a big one, but there's loads of tiny ones. There's one in Ukraine that's to do with managing border crossings and so on, right? So they do a lot of stuff like that. And I don't see it going back. And I think there will remain a tension between NATO and the EU. You can see it now. You can see Macron doing, everyone's like, oh, look at Macron. He's saying that the EU should do more in defense. He's been saying that for ages. Well, this is a big surprise. They came up with this thing called the European Intervention Initiative, which was kind of a way of involving other kind of NATO allies and stuff. So I could see that being used as a sort of Western European Union type thing after, but it doesn't seem to be doing much in Britain. But what I think is the big interesting change in terms of the areas I look at when it comes to like these areas is the rise of China and Russia are raising big questions and changing the way that the EU has to interact with the world. And we're moving towards kind of old school questions of kind of NATO versus Europe, who's responsible here, who's responsible for the defense of Europe. And I think ultimately, I don't see the EU becoming fully integrated, whatever that might look like. But I do think that we'll probably end up maybe expanding some areas of policy, expanding maybe areas that have kind of not impressed very much, like battle groups and so on, haven't really impressed me very much in terms of like what's actually been done with them. I could see there being a little bit more, but I don't think they'll be doing anything offensive. I don't think they'll be doing anything, for example, putting boots in the ground in Ukraine, but they might be offering assistance to EU members who are more likely to be faced by these types of problems. I think there'll be inevitably more crises to do with maybe migration, or actually that's probably one of the, if there is a war, probably going to be one of the big issues is the migration crisis from Ukraine, I would imagine would be a big issue. And that will probably put strain. But I do think the original quote that's in the Schuman Declaration was like that Europe is forged in crises, and that crisis is really the main mechanism through which it moves forward. Because if everything's, if there's an equilibrium, there's no reason to change anything. But if there's crisis, then it will continue to evolve to meet this crisis. So I think there probably will be more integration, but I think everyone's going to be disappointed insofar as the people who want Europe to be a federation are going to be disappointed because I don't think it's going to end up there. I think it will end up kind of. I still think the states will keep their identity within it, and I also think intergovernmentalists are going to be, who think that the states should remain as in, are going to be disappointed as well, because what I like about Europe is everyone's disappointed because it's a nice compromise somewhere in the middle. So my prediction would be kind of a little bit more integration here and there, and a lot of the areas that we face to do with us, to do with core state power, as it's called, will be integrated somewhat. But also, in terms of market integration, I think they're going to, the internet, kind of a lot of problems surrounding this. I think cryptocurrencies and so on, I'm not big on the sort of impact of them, but I think it's useful as an example of a new technology coming around in the EU we're going to have to deal with. Like the digital single market is a huge thing. I think these sorts of questions, and I wrote a speech for, I used to work for an MEP, and I wrote a speech for about the Maastricht Treaty 20 years on, and I said, like in 1992, mobile phones were like this size, and then like the first ever consumer ones I think came out, and then like by 20 years on, so 2012, they were little tiny things, and you could access the internet. Like what the single market was invented to do is always under pressure to change. So I think ultimately the single market's going to have plenty to keep it occupied as well.
One last point, because I really want to touch, because this is quite fascinating things going on right now with Ukraine, Russia. But one side story is this pipeline, gas pipeline between Germany and like Russia. So part of it finished already in 2012. Now it's kind of phase 2, something like that. Do you have any comments on that? Like, so, what is it? I mean, so it looks like, Germany has got this idea to, I need this. So which created problem for, the current position, the political crisis with like Ukraine. So Germany has to be very careful which side it is taking.
Germany, there's always, as with everything, there's long-term and short-term factors. The short-term factors are basically economic fallouts of getting involved with Ukraine, right? So they rely heavily on gas from Russia, and they're under immense amount of pressure from allies to do something, and it looks bad. So I think, to be honest, I think Nord Stream 2 will be cancelled if Russia moves in, because the pressure on the German government is just so colossal. Because ultimately, this is what we're seeing in terms of a great power invading a neighboring country on the European continent to seize territory is like, not seen that in our generation. I mean, the closest equivalent for people who are alive is maybe Czechoslovakia when they had an uprising, or Hungary and the Soviet troops moved it, right? That's maybe the closest equivalent, but they didn't seize territory. They just replaced the government with someone else, right? So I don't. Yeah, we had civil wars in the Balkans and things as well, but then I don't think it's equivalent as well. It's not an equivalent conflict. So this is something completely unseen. I think that will have an effect. And so I do ultimately think Nord Stream 2 would be cancelled, and that's Germany's leverage. But I think in the longer term, I mean, part of this is to do with German energy needs. Nuclear power in Germany is much more controversial than it is here. The German Green Movement has its roots in kind of, partly roots in sort of energy generation, opposition to nuclear power. So, you know, there's debates that will kind of take over to them. So that's one of the factors there. But also, Germany has, in terms of foreign policy, kind of found itself an important role in terms of being multilateral because of its history. And even in the Cold War, there's kind of Ostpolitik, they called it, engaging with the East and trying to be like a mediator. I don't think any of this is particularly a surprise to anyone who knows, at least a sort of, like I do, a relatively meager amount about German foreign policy. France's kind of position in relation to it, in terms of saying, you know, Europe needs a response, and why are you speaking over our heads? Again, doesn't come as a big surprise at all. And to be honest, like, Britain's approach isn't much of a surprise either. I think perhaps Sue Gray's report adds more pressure to try and look decisive that maybe wasn't there previous. But like, in terms of aligning with the US and trying to, promote NATO in Europe. And the thing is, loads of people ask me, if Britain goes, will Europe become more integrated in foreign policy? No, because there are plenty of European states that rely heavily on NATO for their defense, and they're not going to accept NATO being replaced or superseded or whatever. So I think, to me, the sad thing about Brexit is that the UK engaging as a member state in all these negotiations about what Europe should be doing. If you're a supporter of the UK's line, that would be a good thing if we were in those rooms, because we'd be promoting that line with other countries to try and get them to follow us. Whereas we're outside the negotiating room, and so Britain's preferences aren't being listened to the same extent that they would otherwise. So it's a kind of sad factor of all this. And I don't think any of this is a surprise, but when it comes to the German position, again, I don't know how controversial that would be. If someone's an expert in German foreign policy, I'm sure I get crucified for that. But I think this sort of inaction on a crisis is not new. If you remember Libya, the European Union on that, they got pelters for that, and it ended up being NATO basically taking responsibility. There were quite a few different crises. Iraq and Afghanistan as well. You remember Iraq, when younger people will remember that France and Germany were being pilloried, and there were loads of cartoons about them being kind of anti-American. Do you remember French fries got renamed Freedom Fries because they didn't get involved in Iraq? It's not a new thing.
I mean, it's quite interesting, like all those far right parties has got named Freedom Party or Freedom something. It's always something to do with freedom.
Freedom for someone to tell me what identity I have to have, like national freedom from international organizations, or something. But I always think, like, people are like, oh yeah, but do you not like freedom? I'm like, yeah, I do like freedom. That's why I don't like people telling me how I have to identify it. I have to think.
Because you are good in a sense, because you're not dogmatic, or you are not saying that, oh, that's going to happen, or this is the right thing. So it's quite good to see like this kind of understanding about our political processes. Because I mean, I think the modern politics is much more complex, isn't it? There are hundreds of variables, and all those variables, permutations, combination, then we see some kind of outcome from there. So like predicting something, I think most of us actually don't have all those information in front of us, and then quantify. So we might have one thing, but the problem is not enough to tell the full story.
Yeah, but that's what we do. I don't think well, naturally we make predictions, but I think, like, at the end of the day, theories that we read are there to help guide us as to what the important factors we should look out for if we're trying to think, how might this go? And so I think like, what we can offer is we can say these are the important factors we should look at when this is evolving, and here's what might happen with these factors, and these are some factors we can consider. But like making predictions is generally a month's game. I think like if you're going to say firmly this is going to happen, you know, like my prediction about many things is I didn't think Trump would get elected. I didn't think Brexit would happen. I thought Joe Biden would do stronger than he did. So I maybe have a bias towards, you know, people thinking a certain way. But like, you know, was I completely off with these? I don't think so. I think Brexit was not as distant a victory as maybe anticipated. I think there were a lot of factors we didn't think of, like who would stay home. I think Trump ultimately was quite lucky to get in, because a few states he won by a few thousand votes, could have easily gone the other way, in which case everyone would laugh at each other. And Joe Biden, I think, ultimately did pretty strongly against Trump. And when we saw the time before that there was a higher threshold to get over, I don't know. I think like what we can offer generally is educated kind of fact. Here's the factors you can consider moving forward. I think it's very useful to know these things, right? It's not. We shouldn't be using crystal balls. We should be saying, you know, these are the important factors to consider.
Because if anyone can predict, I mean, you know, anything of our modern society, you can be a billionaire. Market will move tomorrow in a positive way. If you just know like yes or no, you can make millions.
Yeah.
Because you have got all that, you know, information in front of you. You know that what's going to happen tomorrow.
I made a joke about economics once and social scientists, which was that we're very good at telling you why things won't happen, and then when they do happen, we tell you why they did. Like, I try not to be that.
No, I mean, I asked that question that when, you know, people became like confident about, you know, what they have learned and trying to execute those knowledge in a different circumstances. So like, for example, you know, like I teach UN politics and also UN peacekeeping as well. So the peacekeeping, which was successful in Egypt during the Suez crisis, was not using the same template, was not successful in like Congo or another place, because things are different, actors are different. The you know, environment is different, the geopolitics is different, all kind of variables there. And then you can get like totally, you know, negative kind of outcome. I'm saying this like, you know, during this like Vietnam War, I think America's state secretary was like McNamara, who has got like some kind of very economics background, economist. So he tried to quantify war, that if you spend this amount of money, you can win the war. So that's quite dangerous model, isn't it? So if you think that, yeah, you know, I can deliver if you give me this amount of resource, this amount of money, this amount of soldiers, but at the same time, perhaps it's not about winning. It's something else, isn't it? The Vietnam War is not about winning. I mean, America could have, you know, flattened the whole Vietnam. Problem is, I mean, is that a win?
No, I don't think. But you know, the objective there originally was just to support the South Vietnamese government, wasn't it? And they were there to train their soldiers to help defend them against the North. And so, what were the victory conditions? The survival of the state. But the state was in complete turmoil as well. There were huge problems of corruption, of soldiers that were being. The same thing happened in Afghanistan. Soldiers that were existent only on paper, so that someone could make their wage, and so they thought they had more soldiers than they did. It's the same thing in Afghanistan. So, but like the idea of winning and losing wars is kind of. I watched a thing once about people's perspectives on Thatcher, right? And they were talking about the Falklands War, and someone said it's the last war that, you know, conventional war you could win. You know, when was the last war that you could just go out and win? Yeah, because they generally like a war. If it's you and I are contesting a piece of territory, the one controlling at the end won, right? You can. But like, it's you know, that's kind of viewing war in its own prism where there's no politics. War is an extension of politics, right? So We all have political aims. So is victory when I get everything I want? No, particularly in a democracy. I don't want me to get everything I want, because if everyone else doesn't want that, then that's authoritarian. So,
but also it kind of doesn't make sense. So you know, the amount of soldiers got killed from this war to save this, or sustain this small island, and like I think 1,600 people. Was it really worth? I mean, or no? We could have just went to that island and asked those people, "Do you know what? We'll give you every family $5 million." Then it's a choice. Do you want to stay here or do you want to go? I think everyone would have accepted $5 million than going through this. Like, so the whole thing is just like, it's just what way you want to say it. I mean, but the families who lost their brothers or husbands, it's total waste.
War in itself is a type of failure. This is one thing I think about this in Russia and Ukraine. Seeing it from a sort of like, if you think back to Britain in the early 1900s, trying to cling on to its empire against revolutions and so on, trying to put them down, it's like it wasn't going to happen, because Britain was, at the end of the day, it wasn't an equal relationship where we were helping, as some people like to imagine it was today. It was ultimately, we controlled these countries for exploitative reasons. We didn't have an empire because it benefited other people. Why would you spend lots of money on a military to control countries to benefit the people there? Logically doesn't make sense. So like, to me, what seems to be the West's biggest asset is the standard of living and civil rights here. They're not great, they could be better, right? By no means is the EU like perfect, or even America like easy, or Canada even. Like, no country you can see is spotless. But when you're in a country when you have limited civil liberties or big corruption problems, and you look at other countries, you want to be more like them. That's the biggest asset I think the West has. So you don't need an army to back that up. And I think it's the biggest weakness that Russia has, is that the type of regime run in Russia is not very, I don't want to live under that. So the only ability they have to keep people under that is through force, and that's a sign of weakness to me rather than strength, because you're going to have people who, as we find in Northern Ireland, which if you kill people, it's not just that, the close relationship, the whole family's now turned against you. And lots of different wars. So war in itself, and the armed conflict, is not a victory, and when you come out of it, there's no guarantee that peaceful settlement's fair even, or it's just. So
because even like for like the people who are actually Russians, if Putin goes, what's next then? It's quite, did you say there's no like normal, natural progression that, oh, nothing will happen, another president. It looks like, they have to wait for that moment as well. In that, crossroad of your life, that Putin died, and then what's next?
What I like is the story that my supervisor once told me, which was he had to review a book when he was a student on the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was in the 80s, and says it's not going to collapse. It's been around forever, and then it collapsed. Because these things can happen all of a sudden, unexpectedly. I don't know how many people expected the Arab Spring to happen, but also how many people expected it to go the way it did ultimately. It's kind of depressing how it's gone, particularly in Tunisia just now, which was seen as the one success of it, and then now there's a big political crisis there. And the thing is as well, of course, I make this point about Ukraine. You mentioned Vietnam, and it was Grenada as well, you mentioned, with this island. These weren't exactly examples of the West kind of putting forward this kind of, look at the standard of living we have, because a lot of the exploitation there was a result of problems problems that the US had backed up. In South Vietnam, they were in a pretty tricky situation at one point, because the person in charge was involved with, I think he was, Vietnamese names, I think it's Diem, is spelled with a D, but it's not a D. But he was a Catholic, I think, and there was an uprising of Buddhists against him, and there was a huge sort of problem and destabilizing factor. And the US now has to make a decision, like, do we back him? Like, what does this mean ethically for us? And that created all sorts of vacuums, and then supporting an authoritarian nationalist dictator essentially is the better of two evils. It's not, I think, like when it comes to the kind of this whole sort of standard of living thing in itself isn't enough as well, because sometimes they end up supporting pretty horrible regimes that aren't anywhere close to what we have here. Because there's some sort of strategic element to it, like, I wonder if that's going to happen when it comes to when China becomes more powerful, if we're going to end up supporting some distasteful regimes to stop the Chinese favored government coming into place. It's I don't want to come across as a kind of, it's what gets me about the IR literature. I read all this stuff about liberalism. And they're like, liberals are utopians, and I'm like, it's not utopian at all. I don't think.
No, like, I mean, as long as this state structure, remains, those problems will be there. This like security dilemma, those crises with self-interest, part and parcel of the game. So like, so the idea about Europe or like some kind of big integration, that's the way out. I think that's the progress for the future.
Yes.
But again, the problem is, I mean, it's linked with how rich you are and then how poor the other guy is. So the integration is difficult, isn't it? It's like social mobility. So so like for me, so we need serious like automation around the globe actually to make that, this like to journey more equal, and then, you will feel comfortable.
One of the things that Terry, one of my supervisors, he was really into, my supervisor was into Terry Moe, because it's institutionalism. So on Terry Moe's sort of ideas that institutions don't have to be fair, the preferences still matter, and that like, these international institutions can be implemented by the rich or the powerful, and it's in their favor because it's in their interest to do it. The institutions don't have to be fair. So I do think that the EU and more cooperation, I still ultimately think globalization in the long run is going to happen and going to continue, and but I do think that the order in the long run is not going to be a utopia. I just find it strange reading about liberal utopianism, and I'm thinking like, I would best be described as a liberal institutionalist, but like not a utopian at all. I don't think we'll have a utopia. I think power will always matter in institutions.
But I think, I mean, that would be a much better version than the current version we have.
Oh yeah, it'd be better, but not. I don't think we'll get utopia at any point. That's no.
More or less things I wanted to cover, touch everything, a bit of economy, a bit of history, a bit of our lives through this, pandemic, how we were surviving, and then early career academic, what you are doing. So it's lots of things going on behind the scene. But also life goes on. Life goes on. So I think it's kind of right time to ask you this question about, like, what will be your advice for the future students who are coming to the university? Because what do you think? Like, will you recommend people to do PhD, any subjects?
Depends on why. But I kind of always. The problem I have is that it's kind of fallacy how I look at these things. I think about what I had wrong. So when I went to study politics in undergrad, I had the impression it would study like how, like how things work and how do you be a politician, things like that, right? Which is not really about it, but analyzing political systems or practices or cultures or justice and concepts and ideals, and analyzing why they are the way they are, what's better, what's worse in terms of normative theory. But so there's that. So kind of being aware of what it is you're going to study is something I would tell myself. But also that, focusing on skills and not trying to get too carried away. Because when I went into undergrad, I was really excited to study all these things. I was trying to read all these different things, and I was getting ahead of myself when all the things I was struggling with were the basic skills, like how to write an essay properly. And that, particularly a lot of motivated students, I think, just need more help when it comes to like, in an essay, this is what you should do. And focus on getting that good in the first 2 years. And then when you get into the next 2 years, you don't have to worry about why am I not getting an A, because it's the skill is there that you have to do. So skills development is very important. When it comes to PhD, should you do a PhD? I think you should if you want to. I think it's a great opportunity if you really want to do one. I did a PhD because I got to the end of my master's and kind of thought, is this it? So that's it. That's all there is to know. But no. So I also had a question. I was very lucky in that, like, just happened to be what I was interested in. I found a gap in the literature, was able to make a project out of it. But like, if you genuinely find the subject interesting, it's a great opportunity to continue with it. It's a lot of stress. It's like, there's a lot of huge problems associated with doing a PhD, and it's, it can be hard to balance these things. But would I go back to myself in the past and say, don't do one? No, because I wanted to do one. If you want a title, I mean, just go out and get a job with a good title.
Yeah.
Go be a counsellor or something, you get a title there. Title doesn't matter. What matters is, do you want to spend 4 years of your life working pretty intensely on a very one question because you enjoy it, or because you for whatever reason. So yeah, do one. But after the PhD is over, there's a lot of pressure to do lots of things, and sometimes one piece of advice is maybe don't finish your PhD the month that probably the day that the first COVID case came about. That didn't help me very much. But, I think I defended mine right at the time COVID probably first kicked off, which isn't great. Just be aware.
You kind of mentioned about this essay writing skill. I mean, I always struggle with the student. I think the writing is the biggest part coming to the university, and if you can master that skill, that means, you can actually sustain your life pretty easily, because you know how to articulate, how to write, how to put your creative stuff there. So it's a kind of, I don't know, it's lots of creativity there, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what I had was, when I was an undergrad, you had kind of 10 minutes in a tutorial where you say you have to have an argument, and it should be kind of bring the essay together and guide all the points. I didn't really know what that meant. Even when I did my undergraduate dissertation, they were saying like, oh, it's too much. Like, it's too broad. And now I understand what they were saying, right? Because now having done a big research project, looking back at that, I was like, yeah, of course, there's no clear dependent variable or anything that I was looking at. So it was kind of a bit off for very obvious reasons. But at the time, you've read all this stuff and you're like, it's the skill of knowing. I think ultimately, like, is it methods? Sometimes when we teach methods, I think we teach it in too abstract a way, in that we have these, this is an interview, and this is the positives and negatives of this hypothetical interview that's like in the abstract. Whereas actually looking at how did people do interviews? One of the best stories I have when I was talking about methods with someone was like, they said, the study you were replicating to measure this variable, they asked 14 academics to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 where it was at different points in time, right? That was their method. And they said, oh, well, they asked 14 more than I did. So sometimes the way that variables are quantified isn't as professional as you might get in a methods course, but that's really useful insofar as like you actually, looking at actual studies in a particular area or looking at how they did their methods is actually useful for guiding your practice. I also think in terms of methods, sometimes we teach it in terms of like the, again, we're looking in the abstract and these things, but like research design, we look at what's inductive versus deductive, but actually like guiding students through how should you go about it and the practicalities of it and linking it to actual practice. I think one of the best ways to teach methods would probably be to design their, to use it as a chance to design their dissertation in 4th year for undergrad, right? That should be like a sort of prospectus, or whatever you want to call it, would be the end result of that course, because then they're applying what they know in a useful way and seeing how it is they're making these trade-offs and decisions. But the point is that we do have all the bits of skills that they need to learn, but they're not always intuitively connected. When you learn methods, you're just, sometimes as a student, you think, okay, I just need to learn this and pass the course, rather than think, oh, this is what I'm meant to be doing. This is what the articles I read, this is what they're doing. So you're kind of reading it as this abstract thing, when really actually it's something that's really useful for a lot of what you're doing day to day. And the best way to do it is to introduce certain things, like what is an argument? What is a, how do you test an argument in an essay? Like, how do you pick your points? What do you reference? These are all skills that you can develop slowly. and they're all ultimately methodological. They're to do with research design, right? So it's just, I also think there's sometimes a gap that you use these jargon words when it's actually like, it's not just jargon, this is actually really useful. When you define your terms, you're not just defining your terms so you know what we mean. You're setting the scope of your analysis, you're showing you're technically, operationalizing a variable. We wouldn't use these terms, but that's what they're doing. And so trying to find a way to try and make these sort of methods teaching a bit less like a little section you teach them at once, but something that's more they engage with throughout the degree, I think would help with that skills development. And make it less boring. I think people will be less bored because they know why they need to know it. Because it seems to me there's a lot of students who get to the end of their degree and they're like, I wish I paid more attention in methods class or whatever. Or, I wish I paid more attention to this. Now I've got to do my dissertation. Whereas like...
in my case, and what I do in the third year, fourth year especially, so I've got like 2 textbooks for the students, and one textbook is very simple, easy, small. What I ask them in the first 2 weeks, just read that whole book. Because what the students do, like who actually get poor marks in their essay, because they haven't done that, proper understanding about the whole thing. So they just like read in a couple of chapters, couple of very specific articles, and they tend to write an essay on that. And I think that's quite, so what it does, he or she doesn't have enough information or enough understanding of the big picture. And I think that and kind of that exposed them in the essay that, oh, it looks like it's just a generic B2 or B3 essay, not like A5 or A2 or A1 essay, because that's like, you need lots of discipline to go to like from B2 to A1 or A2. Like one example I tend to give, like, famous boxer Muhammad Ali. So he was saying that, the match is actually decided before the actual match, a long time ago. Because what practice you are doing, what kind of diet you are doing, what kind of, discipline, the regime, the hours you are spending. So we just see like, the just 1 hour show or in like Las Vegas in the middle of the night. But the problem is that the groundwork is already done, and the boxer actually knew that what's going to happen on that day. So if you look at like, and then another example I try to give, like, just like football matches. We see like all those football matches happen on like Saturday or Sunday, but the major work is done every single day of the week. You start the day at 5 a.m. and then, do practice for 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours. So if you haven't done those, thing, you just cannot execute that actual game, which is you writing essay or exam. It's like lots of groundwork you need to do. It's not easy. It's not like, simple. It's a complex process. But if you haven't mastered that process, and I think the execution will be always poor, will not be optimal.
Like one thing with IR in particular is that early on it's quite theoretical. So one thing that I do is say, right, so, trying to bring in kind of how do you read a theory? Like what are the component parts of the theory? So what are the key concepts that they use? What are the key assumptions they make? What are the, introducing the term mechanism, but basically like after there's a question like, how is it that politics is carried out? How does change actually happen? Like how do we think it is? And just interrogating the assumptions. And I think sometimes when you're a student, you read a chapter and it's not clear what you're trying to parse out of it, right? Because you read about in realism, like, oh, Thucydides and Machiavelli and so on, but they're not the important bit. What's important is what is it they have in common, and what's the kind of, what are the assumptions that are common throughout all these writers? And so that's one thing that I think is important from a teaching perspective to train is kind of, what is it you're looking for in the readings? But I think you're right as well, that like just trying to find all these things on their own will get you far, but not get you far enough to really excel, which is when you have to actually read the materials and try and engage with them and read the book. Reading, I really liked the book review that I did in undergrad because I read Francis Fukuyama, and it was one of the few times in undergrad where I read the whole book, and actually I went, yeah, this is actually very interesting. And of course, now you look back and you're like, yeah, I should have been doing more of that. But at the time, I was just like, no, you do the readings. But no, it's actually good if students are motivated, but also focusing on the skills.
I mean, you have to enjoy your subject areas, and you have to have the passion. Otherwise, you'll not enjoy, and then it doesn't make any sense. Just
I tell student PhD people when I talk to them about it, I always say you'll see these people who are in the library till 10 p.m. Don't care. It doesn't matter what they do, because I remember seeing people in the library till 10 p.m. They're sitting on Facebook, so you don't know what they're doing. It's all for show, and ultimately, all that matters is, are you doing what you need to be doing to get to the end point? Are you doing what you need to do? If you do that in 7 hours or 8 hours or 12 hours, it doesn't matter. Personally, I don't like working in the evenings because I want to. I'll do it if I need to, but if I can try and make time to spend with my fiance as a human being, I will. So I'll work a little bit later, so at least like the time after dinner, we've got time together to relax and not think about it. Because sometimes thinking about things are too much doesn't help. If you don't stop thinking about it, you don't get to take a step back. So time not working is valuable. So don't let people who are working all the time make you feel scared. But really, all you need to worry about is, am I doing what I need to be doing? Forget everyone else. What's my plan? What do I need to get done by the end of this year? Am I on track to do that? If I'm not, what can I do to try and help? What can I do in a healthy and sustainable way to do it as well? Because making yourself worried or unhealthy is not going to speed up the process. It's going to make it slower and more difficult. So you hit the deadline, but the work could have been better because you made your life more difficult. Because it's ultimate. I think just taking a step back, the biggest piece of advice I would say is, imagine that you were talking to another PhD student and they were coming up with the problems that you have. What would you tell them? Because 9 out of 10 times, we would tell the other person to go easy on themselves, take it easy, don't stress, focus on what you need to do. And we would give someone else really fair advice. But when it's ourselves, we're all really hard on ourselves. So don't try and treat yourself as you would others. It kind of a weird inverse of the golden rule. But
I use this thing, I tell my students, time to time you have to go for fishing. Just go for fishing. You need leisure in your life, and if you don't do it, you are punishing yourself. You have to find the time to go for fishing. So it's like, so you have to give your brain that kind of landscape, to calm it down. If you just feed in all kind of stuff, complex stuff continuously in your brain, it will not produce good stuff because it's tired.
It's time that you don't feel guilty for not working.
Yep.
You're relaxing and you're going, I don't need to work now. I could choose to if I wanted, but knowing that I don't have to. Which is why, sometimes I'll do something if it needs done, and I can live with it. Then okay, I'll do it that once. But we're not talking regular. And then I'd rather work later in work hours and then have that time where I don't feel I have to be working, but you can not work at that time. That's very valuable, I think. And then,
especially if you have got some kind of hobbies, some kind of interest, some kind of I know you are a football fan. You support a particular team. You're quite passionate about that, It kind of it's like you're going for fishing, watch the team's game.
And it's like you can talk to people about it. It's not to do with work as well. That's why I like football, because you can go and you're tired of talking about chancellors and deans and policies from unis. You can go and talk about the referee was rubbish. There's some guys in football who want to write a dissertation after every game about formation problems, and I'm just no. As far as I'm concerned, the referee was either great or awful, and we did great or awful. That's all I'm going to talk about. Who's coming in? Who's going out? It's just a way of chilling out and taking your mind away. It's escapism. It's the same as fishing. It's the same as art or anything else. It's escapism.
Yeah. Louis, absolute pleasure. We had a good session today.
Okay, all the best.
Okay, bye.